Our next speaker has been compared to President Obama. Not because he's a black American president, of course, because he's such a great public speaker. That being said, Adam, let me give you a couple of tips for your speech before you begin. A good speech should have a good beginning and a good end, preferably close together. Don't tell everyone about Chris's slightly camp side after he's had a few drinks. Oops. A good speech is like a miniskirt, short enough to be interesting and long enough to cover the essentials. Whatever you do, don't tell the truth about the stag do. We don't want this to be the shortest wedding in history. What happens on tour stays on tour. Anyway, there's clapping there. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for Chris's brother, the headline act for the evening, the best man, Mr. Adam Sturmer.
Are we on? Okay, well, I'd like to start by saying I like Nick a lot less now. No, but ladies and gentlemen, as Nick mentioned, my name is Adam Sturmer, or Adam Sturmer because I'm Chris's younger brother. So I'd like to start by saying that it's an absolute honour and a pleasure to be Chris's best man for one of the most important days for his and Georgina's life. With Chris having been my best man just 6 months ago, you would have thought that it would have been a slam dunk that I was to be his. But actually not. Because I can tell you that first of all, he asked his best looking friend to make the photos look good. But luckily he said no. So then Chris asked his his most intelligent friend to make sure the logistics went well. But he also said no. Finally, he asked his brother. At which point I just couldn't refuse 3 times, so here I am today. But joking aside, there are many significant advantages of being Chris's best man after he's been mine. The first one is, you know how hard to go on stag do, and I think we certainly tested that theory. And by the way, Chris, you may have thought that you called mum on your stag do, but you don't know who I switched the numbers with. And the second is that, what is the second? The second is that he'll never be able to get me back for what I'm about to tell you. Because, ladies and gentlemen, as is traditional, I'd like to enlighten a few of those who don't know Chris all that well on the type of person he is and what Georgina is letting herself in for. So, the story of Chris Sturmer all starts in 1978, when he was born on the 27th of March. It was a memorable day, for Mum in particular, for 2 main reasons. Firstly, Chris was a huge baby, born an eye-watering 9 pounds 3 ounces big. Well done, Mum. Secondly, and more importantly, both Mum and Dad had to come to terms with the fact that Chris was ginger. Although I am told they did consider a baby swap in the birth centre, they have loved him dearly ever since. And nowadays, as Nick pointed out earlier, it's actually quite difficult to tell what colour Chris's hair is, because let's face it, he's just plain bald. And don't worry, I'll be there with you in a few years. Okay, well, as much as we love him for it, because it's quite endearing, and I think he'd be the first to admit that Chris is a little bit, just a little bit, of a geek. Even looking back on his childhood, even from a young age, he was always, his techie side was coming out because he was always fascinated in gadgets and taking things apart. And if you look at his hobbies now, not much has changed. Tropical fish keeping, replica model boat making with natural wood, and of course his favourite hobby of collecting and flying radio-controlled model aeroplanes. Which, to give him his due, he is extremely good at. But at this point, ladies and gentlemen, if I could please ask you to open envelope number 1 on your table. Everyone should have one. And I hope you enjoy, as I did, the NHS specs and the very high gum-to-teeth ratio. Nowadays, Chris owns 3 model aeroplanes and 1 model heli. And on this point of Chris being just a little bit geeky, Georgie can hardly claim ignorance because her most recent present to Chris was an annual subscription to Model Aircraft magazine. Rock and roll. Chris does also indulge, of course, in far more cool sports like skydiving and motorbiking. But since they make him out to look far too good, we're going to move swiftly on. Chris and I, of course, are the best of mates now. But when we were much younger, like many siblings, we certainly had our moments. And Chris didn't always play by the rules in our play fights, because I remember a particular spat when we decided to settle it with a proper boxing match, which, by the way, was my first mistake because Chris was 3 years older than me and not exactly slim in those days. Yeah. But while I was there, well, the problem is we only had 1 set of boxing gloves, so we had to fight with 1 hand only. So whilst I was there, do you remember, diligently making a boxing ring with the sofa cushions, and before I'd even realised that Chris had thrown the left-hand glove at my feet and put on the more dominant right hand, I was flat on my back after a swift right hook and a bloody nose, which I thought was grossly unfair. However, I did manage to get him back a few years later when on the golf course of Butlins with Grandad. A super swerve golf shot from me hit Chris standing in the rough from 40 yards, square on the back of the head, knocking him out cold. And I don't think he's been the same ever since, which explains a few things. However, on the flip side, luckily for me, my ball bounced quite a long way back onto the fairway, and Grandad ruled it far too accurate a shot to be deemed intentional. Okay. Well, I couldn't have hit him too hard in the head, because Chris is, and always has been, extremely, annoyingly intelligent. However, I find it far more fun to regale stories of Chris's more idiotic patches. So, examples of where Chris's high levels of intelligence very temporarily escaped him include not realising that pulling a handbrake turn whilst driving a car 60 miles an hour in a bumpy field would not result in rolling the car, make that my car, several times. Nor in fact was nearly chopping his hand off trying to stop the propeller of a petrol engine model aircraft with his hand, having to hold it together and go to hospital for 20 stitches. But we're all human. Around the age of 17, 18, Chris hit what I like to call his rebel phase. With his newfound idol being temporarily switched away from Bill Gates to Kurt Cobain, Chris grew his ginger locks long past his shoulders and pierced his nose with a ring. So now, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like you to open number 2 on your thing and see if you can see any similarities. Well, for most people, growing their hair long and piercing their nose would be enough. But not for our Chris. Being far too cool for normality, he also threw his bed out, instead opting for a mattress on the floor, street style, and graffitied his entire bedroom with spray paint. Now, I'm not sure what was a deeper shade of red. The slogan that scrawled "Death to the World," or Mum and Dad's faces when they saw his room. But either way, when I entered this new psychedelic world, I asked Chris what the overlay of red-blue semi-opaque dripping paint was in the corner of one of the walls, at which point he looked at me in disdain. He picked up a Jimi Hendrix CD, and whilst rolling his eyes, he said, "Oh, that's my Purple Haze, man." Well, somehow, Chris managed to do exceptionally well in his A-levels, getting 2 A's and a B, allowing him to go to Bristol University, many of whom friends he met are here tonight. No cheer? Okay. And at the time, he chose psychology,